After World War II, the United States faced a massive surplus of military vehicles. Thousands of American Jeeps left idle across airfields, storage depots, and desert lots. These vehicles, once indispensable to soldiers on every battlefield, suddenly had no purpose in a peacetime world. Some were sold to civilians, others stripped for parts, and many were sent to scrap yards, their engines silenced and metal recycled. The sheer scale of production now became a burden, and the fate of these Jeeps was determined by practicality rather than legacy. While a few were preserved or restored, the majority disappeared, marking the end of their wartime chapter and the start of a new, uncertain civilian existence. The war was over, but the world had not yet fully realized the cost of its victory. In the chaotic months that followed the surrender of Axis forces, the vast machinery of war that had propelled the United States to global dominance began to be dismantled. Tens of thousands of military vehicles, once considered crucial to the war effort, now stood in yards, rusting quietly under the changing skies. Among them, a ubiquitous symbol of the conflict, the Jeep. The American Jeep, a workhorse of the war, had been indispensable. Small, rugged, and versatile, it had carried soldiers across every theater of the conflict, from the mud of Europe to the jungles of the Pacific. During the war, over 640,000 of these vehicles were produced, their engines rumbling across battlefields, making them one of the most iconic and essential pieces of equipment in the U.S. military arsenal. But once the war ended in 1945, these vehicles, which had been made for destruction, now faced an uncertain future. There was no longer a pressing need for such a fleet of cars built for combat. With the return to peacetime, the question emerged: what happens to such an enormous surplus of military vehicles? The United States found itself with a staggering number of Jeeps, most in good condition, but now redundant. To some, these vehicles were symbols of victory, remnants of a world-shaping conflict. To others, they were an economic burden, an inventory of excess that had no place in a country rebuilding after a devastating war. In the immediate aftermath, the U.S. government was confronted with a difficult choice. A massive demobilization effort was underway, and it had to cope with the practicalities of scaling back the wartime economy. The federal budget needed to be reallocated to other priorities, and the military no longer had the budget to support the upkeep of such vast quantities of surplus vehicles. As a result, a large number of Jeeps were disposed of quickly, but the methods of disposal varied greatly. One of the first solutions was to sell them off, cheaply. Some Jeeps were sold to civilian buyers, mostly farmers, ranchers, and business owners who found the rugged vehicle ideal for tasks beyond military use. The Jeep's simple design and sturdy construction made it perfect for agricultural work, and its affordability in the post-war economy was a draw for many. However, the scale of the surplus far exceeded civilian demand. It wasn't just a matter of selling off surplus equipment to the public. Many of these Jeeps were not well suited for civilian life in the long term, and their low price often made them a temporary fix for farmers or rural businesses who could afford little else. Still, the scale of the disposal efforts went far beyond private sales. The government turned to scrapping, an option that offered the chance to recover valuable materials, but one that also meant the destruction of countless vehicles. The war industry, which had once operated at full throttle, now had to adjust to peacetime priorities. The huge yards, which had once assembled military equipment, now became depositories of surplus, ready to be torn apart for whatever resources they could yield. The Jeeps were stripped down, metal, rubber, and parts scavenged and sent to recycling centers. The engines, transmissions, and other key components were taken apart and repurposed, often used in civilian machinery or resold as spare parts for other military vehicles. This vast destruction process took place in several locations across the United States, but the most notable was the large-scale disposal effort in the vicinity of the California desert. The desert was vast, and its dry, arid environment made it an ideal location for storing surplus vehicles in the interim, even if only for a short time. As the months passed, the scale of the destruction grew. The government's efforts to clear out these surplus vehicles were relentless. But for every Jeep sold or repurposed, there were thousands more being discarded, their engines silenced forever, their wheels never to turn again. For those who were part of the process, The Jeep's fate was inevitable, a casualty of war's end, its once prized status now irrelevant. At the time, no one fully considered the long-term consequences of such widespread destruction. The demand for military vehicles dwindled as the economy shifted, and the global climate for war material became hostile to any further arms accumulation. The Jeep, once the symbol of American military mobility, now became a relic of a past war, destined to fade from collective memory. Yet, as these Jeeps were melted down and recycled, something surprising began to happen. In some regions, small groups of enterprising individuals began to take notice. Some recognized the inherent value of these vehicles, not just in their parts, but in the vehicles themselves. The Jeep, with its distinctive look and solid build, was also an American icon, and a small but growing group of collectors began to find new purpose for the discarded Jeeps. They were restored, repainted, and given new life. These enthusiasts saw something in the Jeep that others did not. A symbol of independence, resilience, and a link to the past. While the Jeeps may have been discarded by the military and forgotten by the government, they found new homes, many in the form of civilian collectors who would maintain and cherish them for decades to come. But this wasn't true for the vast majority of surplus vehicles, many of which continued to face the cold fate of scrap metal. By the end of 1946, the reality was clear. The American Jeep, for all its wartime glory, had been reduced to a liability. Thousands of Jeeps sat idle, waiting for their final fate to be sealed. Only a few would be saved, and even fewer would continue to serve in new roles, their engines purring once more, but most would simply disappear into the metal furnaces of history. In the years that followed the end of World War II, the surplus American Jeeps, once celebrated for their unparalleled performance during the conflict, continued to face an uncertain future. As the post-war world sought to rebuild, it soon became clear that the extraordinary scale of wartime production had outpaced the demands of peacetime society. While many Jeeps were sold to civilians, and others were stripped of valuable parts and recycled, the real fate of these vehicles would stretch far beyond what anyone could have anticipated in those early, uncertain months. As the war concluded and the United States transitioned from a wartime economy to a peacetime one, the government's decision to offload military surplus was driven by both economic necessity and political pressure. The American economy had been booming during the war, but now, the task was to shift the resources and manufacturing capabilities back to consumer goods and services. The massive army of military equipment, tanks, aircraft, and of course, Jeeps, now had little place in the civilian sphere. The cost of maintaining such an inventory was too high, and with a global peace settling in, the need for so many military vehicles had evaporated overnight. It was during this period of intense transformation that thousands of Jeeps, once an indispensable part of the wartime effort, were stripped from service and discarded. The federal government, burdened by the enormous costs of demobilization, made the decision to offer surplus military vehicles for sale at public auctions. What began as a trickle of sales turned into a flood, as farmers, small business owners, and other civilians snapped up the now inexpensive vehicles. The Jeeps, originally designed for battlefields, found themselves being used in a variety of unexpected roles, hauling crops, transporting goods, and assisting in construction projects. For some, these rugged machines were a symbol of resilience, a piece of wartime history to be cherished and preserved. However, not all the surplus Jeeps would meet a happy ending. For every civilian buyer who drove off with a freshly purchased Jeep, there were hundreds more left in storage or awaiting scrapping. The sheer number of vehicles overwhelmed civilian demand. This was a problem exacerbated by the fact that many of these vehicles, despite being rugged and reliable, were ill-suited for the demands of civilian life. After all, they had been built for combat, not comfort, and their heavy-duty design didn't always translate well to everyday civilian use. Some were sold off, but many more simply languished, left to rust in vast fields and depots. Beyond the sale of surplus vehicles, the government turned to a more pragmatic solution: scrapping. The sheer scale of this effort was staggering. Large government-run depots, many situated in the deserts of California, became the final resting places for many Jeeps. The vast, open spaces of the desert were ideal for storing these vehicles temporarily. But in reality, the fate of many of these vehicles was sealed the moment they arrived. They were disassembled, their valuable parts removed, and the remaining metal melted down or sent to recycling plants. Engines were stripped from their chassis, tires removed, and fuel tanks emptied. It was an industrial process meant to recover any usable materials before the rest was discarded into oblivion. While some parts were salvaged and repurposed, most Jeeps met a quiet end. The raw materials, steel, aluminum, rubber, were sent to factories where they would be turned into something new. The idea of preserving the Jeep's historical significance seemed far from the minds of those in charge. At the time, it was simply a matter of dealing with the surplus in the most cost-effective way possible. The military-industrial complex that had been so efficient at churning out weapons and equipment during the war now faced the complex task of dismantling its own creations. Each vehicle stripped of its parts represented not only a loss of materials but also a poignant reminder of the devastation wrought by the war and the sacrifices made by countless men and women who had served in it. In the early years after the war, very few people were interested in preserving these vehicles. The Jeep, for all its iconic status, was just another machine that had fulfilled its purpose. Its wartime role was over, and now, in the face of the overwhelming need to rebuild a post-war world, it became something to be discarded. But as the years passed, something unexpected began to happen. A small but growing number of enthusiasts started to see the Jeep in a new light, not just as a surplus military vehicle, but as a piece of American history. The first signs of a Jeep renaissance were subtle. A few individuals, often veterans of the war, began to restore these vehicles, bringing them back to their original state. They recognized the cultural and historical significance of the Jeep, and they worked to preserve these vehicles not just as machines, but as symbols of the wartime spirit and the nation's strength during the war years. For these early collectors, restoring a Jeep wasn't just about restoring a piece of machinery, it was about preserving a connection to a past that had shaped the world. Over the next few decades, the Jeep's reputation as a workhorse of war grew into something more profound, a cultural artifact. The restoration of Jeeps became a hobby for many, particularly in the post-war era. Clubs formed, and communities of Jeep enthusiasts began to gather. What had once been a symbol of military might was now being cherished as a piece of American heritage. Some collectors focused on bringing Jeeps back to their original military configurations, while others embraced the idea of customizing these vehicles for civilian use. What had once been a discarded object now became a treasured possession. While these private efforts to restore and preserve Jeeps were occurring, the official attitude towards surplus military vehicles continued to be one of indifference. The government's primary focus remained on post-war economic stability, and the idea of preserving war-era machinery seemed frivolous to many in power. As a result, much of the surplus military equipment, including thousands of Jeeps, continued to meet a quiet fate of disposal and destruction. It wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s that the value of these surplus vehicles started to gain broader recognition. By then, the world had begun to look back more critically at the events of the 1940s, and the Jeep became a symbol of wartime perseverance. As the years passed, the interest in vintage vehicles grew, and Jeeps, once symbols of military dominance, began to find new life in the hands of collectors, historians, and enthusiasts alike. These enthusiasts, many of whom were deeply invested in preserving history, began to form organizations and clubs specifically dedicated to the Jeep. By the 1980s, the Jeep had undergone a transformation. From being a symbol of war to a symbol of nostalgia, the vehicle had transcended its military origins. What had once been viewed as a surplus military machine was now a cherished part of American cultural history. It had become a symbol of resilience, practicality, and rugged individualism, values that resonated deeply in post-war America. However, despite the increasing popularity of these vehicles, the question remains: why, despite their undeniable significance, were so many Jeeps destroyed in the first place? The reasons for this widespread waste are complex and rooted in the pragmatics of post-war economics. For the government, the surplus vehicles were simply an unwanted burden, and with the desire to rebuild and repurpose resources, there was little thought given to preserving them. In hindsight, This destruction seems tragic, especially considering the value these vehicles would later hold, not only as historical artifacts, but as a connection to the shared experience of war. In the final years of the 20th century and into the 21st century, the Jeep's status only continued to grow. Vintage military Jeeps became sought-after collector's items, often fetching high prices at auctions. The Jeep had become not only a symbol of American ingenuity but also a symbol of how the tides of history can reshape the meaning of a single object. What had been abandoned as surplus was now treasured as a tangible connection to a pivotal moment in history. But for all its newfound significance, the fate of the surplus Jeeps of the post-war era remains a bittersweet chapter in the story of American military history. Thousands of these vehicles, once indispensable to the U.S. war effort, met untimely and unceremonious ends, erased from history as resources were repurposed, recycled, or simply discarded. Yet, through the efforts of collectors and enthusiasts, many have been saved from complete oblivion, transformed into living reminders of a time when the Jeep was much more than a symbol of the past. It was a symbol of the world's collective struggle and ultimate triumph. In the end, the story of the surplus Jeeps after World War II is not just about a vehicle or an era. It is about the fragility of history itself, how the past can be lost or forgotten, only to be rediscovered and valued anew by those who understand its significance. The Jeep may have been surplus in the immediate aftermath of the war, but in the years that followed, it found a new purpose, a new life, as an enduring emblem of American perseverance, both during the war and long after it had ended.